Hiya. Okay, so this is section 5 of control and communication. So we are nearly done with this ginormous key area, and it is all about blood glucose regulation. Now, this is the exam question I'd say that crops up most frequently about this whole key area, and it's the one that's usually worth the most points. There are quite a few, 6 different things to know about this area, and then you need to get the 6 different things in the right order, in the right place.
Okay, so we are going to be looking at the 2 different hormones that control blood glucose level, where they work and how they work. So basically the whole role of blood glucose is low or blood glucose is high, how do we get it back to normal?
Okay, so you need to be able to name the 2 hormones that are involved in regulating blood glucose levels and say what they do. Name the 2 organs involved in regulating blood glucose levels and say what they do. Name the 2 carbohydrates involved in regulating blood glucose levels and describe their interaction with the organs and the hormones. And then explain how the points above link to low and high blood glucose. That's the key skill that the SQA is likely to go for, is if blood glucose is low, what are the hormones involved, what are the organs involved, what are the carbohydrates, and what is happening to them.
Okay, so it's important to know that this question does quite often come up as an extended response, so 4 or 5 mark question, or it will come up in some horrible kind of diagram where you have to kind of figure out what in God's name is going on. So you need to know what each of these things are like individually to be able to identify them as part of the whole. So the first thing we're going to look at is 2 types of carbohydrate. Now the first one you should have heard of. We have talked about it. We're going to talk about it lots more. Is one you should know of, and it is glucose. Now glucose is a sugar, so it is a type of carbohydrate. On the right, I've got what we will represent as one glucose molecule, so it's like an orange hexagon. If you see a molecule like that with a G in it, we are saying this is one molecule of glucose. It is found as a single molecule like that, so there's no other bits joined onto it. It is just one standalone molecule. And obviously, you probably already know this, some of you might not, but our blood glucose levels have to remain pretty constant at all times for us to be healthy and alive. But obviously, when you eat something with glucose in it, so sugar in it, which is everything, your blood glucose levels will rise. And obviously, if you've not eaten in a while, your blood glucose levels will drop. But your body has a kind of mechanism to maintain your blood glucose levels, and that's what we're going to be looking at.
Okay, glycogen is carbohydrate number 2. In this video, we'll be looking at 2 carbohydrates, 2 hormones, and 2 organs. Okay, so glycogen is the second carbohydrate. Glucose is the first, glycogen is the second. Glycogen is a storage carbohydrate. This is how we store glucose initially, okay? So if you want to keep some, say you've just eaten a massive meal and you don't need to use all of your glucose right now inside your muscles and tissues, you want to save some of that glucose for later, then you save it as glycogen. It's a storage carbohydrate made up of joining glucose units together. And when it's in this form, that is how it gets stored, okay? If blood glucose levels are too high, glucose gets converted to glycogen to be stored in the liver. That is a key fact you need to know. Glucose is turned into glycogen and it's stored in the liver. Now you need insulin for this, but we'll get into the roles of the 2 hormones in a second.
And again, as you can see, that when it is those glucose change, so it's like on the bottom right here, it was the same on the last slide, that is what glycogen looks like. So if it's a single orange hexagon in the G in our videos, that's glucose. If it's a chain, it is now glycogen instead. And that they might not necessarily appear as an orange hexagon with a G in it in your exam, but they probably will appear slightly similar, single molecules and then a chain. So we've done our 2 carbohydrates. We've got glucose, we have got glycogen. We have now got our 2 hormones, the first of which is insulin. So insulin, it is a hormone. You do need to know that fact. It means it's produced by an endocrine gland, which is, in this case, the pancreas. And insulin is required when blood glucose levels are too high. A nice way to think about it is when blood glucose levels are increased, you need insulin. So it's kind of like they spell out the same thing. They both start with in. So when this happens, so when your blood glucose levels are too high, insulin will bind to receptors on the liver cell. And this will cause the conversion of glucose to glycogen. So insulin doesn't do the conversion itself. It binds to receptors on the liver and basically says, right, now we can do this thing. Now we can get that glucose, chain it all together to become glycogen, where it will then be stored in the liver.
That's a very important language point. If you say in an exam paper or a test paper that insulin turns glucose into glycogen, no points, because it doesn't do that. Insulin binds to receptors on the liver cells, and the liver cells convert glucose to glycogen and store it inside the liver for later.
And this is just a lovely GIF showing that. So as it shows, you've got the bloodstream, you've got that little yellow ball that is insulin. Insulin binds to that complementary receptor on the surface of our target cell. Only once it is bound will it then allow the glucose to go into the cell? So that cell would be in our liver. Once that glucose is then in the liver, it becomes glycogen. It all gets chained up together.
Okay, hormone number 2 is called glucagon, and yes, we have got a wonderful array of names that all sound identical just to be fun for you. This is the one time where spelling is really important. We normally in biology, as long as you can't mistake it for another word, we're fairly easy-ozy on the spelling stuff, but we are not when it comes to this. Glucagon, glucose, and glycogen must all be spelled perfectly because they all sound identical, and if you say something like glucogen, we have no idea what you're talking about. Are you talking about glycogen or glucagon? We just can't.
We find people quite often try and do that to try and get away with it. If you don't put it right, you don't get the mark in this one. Simple as that.
So glucagon is hormone number 2, and it is required when blood glucose levels are low. So if you don't have enough blood glucose, say you've starved yourself or you're fasting, you've not eaten for a while, you don't want to run out of blood glucose because that will kill you. So instead what you need to do is start breaking down your store of glucose in the liver. And this is what glucagon does.
I like to say, when glucose is gone, we use glucagon.
Okay, so glucagon travels in the blood, binds to receptors on liver cells. Liver cells then will convert the glycogen into glucose and release it into the blood, and that will cause blood glucose to go back to normal. Okay, so you've starved yourself for a while, you get glucagon released, it'll go to your liver, and that will start releasing glucose from your liver. Your blood glucose will go up, and you'll feel like you have a bit more energy maybe, or you just, should feel a little bit better in general.
Okay, so we've done our 2 carbohydrates, glucose and glycogen. We've done our 2 hormones, which are insulin and glucagon. What is left is our 2 organs, which we have already named them both, but just to touch on them specifically. The first one is the pancreas. So the pancreas has 2 main roles. Its first one is that it has receptors that will sense a change in blood glucose levels. And the second one is that it produces the hormones insulin and glucagon. So it is an endocrine gland because it produces hormones.
Okay. The liver is our second organ, which we've already mentioned. It has 2 main roles, and it is where glycogen is stored. It's where glucagon and insulin both work. Okay, so glycogen gets stored or glucose is broken down and released from the liver. Okay, so we need to make sure that you've got your 2 organs very, very clear. The thing that people struggle with this one is they don't know what's an organ, what's a hormone, what's a carbohydrate. They don't understand what these things are. So this is why we have separated them out. 2 carbohydrates are glucose and glycogen. 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon. 2 organs, pancreas for releasing the hormones, liver where the hormones are going to work and do their thing.
Which is what the next slide should say. There we go. So you need to know these. You need to be able to separate them into these groups. Now, what we should say is, again, this often comes up as a 4 or 5 mark essay question, which we have not really discussed in this. You might get said, okay, someone has just eaten a really, really big meal, so the blood glucose levels are going to go to high. What happens to get them back to normal? Or conversely, they have gone too low. How does it get back to normal? And you have to start with the idea of the pancreas has receptors which sense blood glucose levels are too high or too low. And then you have to go through the process of, is insulin produced? Is glucagon produced? Is it glycogen? Is it glucose? Which one is which? So you have to kind of go through the points that we've said and break it down into a too high side and a too low side as well.
Okay, so to summarize, insulin is produced by the pancreas when blood glucose is high, and this causes the liver to convert glucose to glycogen.
Glucagon is produced by the pancreas when blood glucose is low and causes the liver to convert glycogen back to glucose.
Glycogen is a storage carbohydrate that you find in the liver.
Glucose is a small carbohydrate found in a single molecule in the bloodstream.
And you should remember it's needed for aerobic respiration. The pancreas is the endocrine gland that's going to release both insulin and glucagon depending on blood glucose level. So if blood glucose is high, it's insulin. Blood glucose is low, it will release glucagon.
And your liver is the organ that will store glycogen and also the one that will release glucose if required.
Okay, so these are key things that you must know. And again, this is a hard topic, which is why we stripped it right back to its bare bones and not covered things like full stories of what happens on here. But we've given you absolute basics. If you do get an essay question or something like that, or not an essay question, but an extended response on insulin, or sorry, on blood glucose, if you can remember these points that are in front of you here, you should get most of the marks, even if you accidentally end up writing about low blood glucose when you're supposed to write about high. If you can say everything, you should manage to cover all of the bases.
Okay, so to summarise, you should be able to name the 2 hormones involved in regulating blood glucose. What are the hormones?
Insulin and glucagon.
You should be able to name the 2 organs involved in regulating blood glucose levels.
Pancreas and liver.
You should be able to name the 2 carbohydrates involved.
Glucose and glycogen.
And you should be able to explain how the points above link to low and high blood glucose, which I would recommend write basically a sample answer for it. Take a sheet of paper, write, okay, high blood glucose levels, how do we get back to normal?
So that would
write
be
down all the
pancreas, insulin, liver, glycogen is made. Or if low blood glucose, it would be pancreas, glucagon, liver, glucose will be released off of glycogen.
And always ending with back to normal levels.
Key language points in here, things like talking about the fact that, again, insulin and glucagon travel in the bloodstream. They will bind to receptors on the liver, and making sure we never ever say glucagon converts glycogen to glucose, and we never say insulin converts glucose to glycogen. It's always the liver cells that do that because of the binding. Okay, now that is us done controlling communication. The next key area is so much shorter and nicer. It's
Really
reproduction.
short,
It's really nice and
Probably
short.
one video
We've got
long.
animal
Maybe
reproduction, plant reproduction,
two, yeah.
delightfully short, delightfully easy compared to this stuff here.
Yes.
See you then.